This is a presentation about how plants grow. Now, plants grow in the wild quite successfully without any human attention or intervention. And most of the plants that we're growing as crops are derived from plants that grew quite successfully without any human intervention in the wild. So let's take a look at how this works, because we've got this idea in agriculture that we have to do a lot to get plants to grow properly. And there must be something amiss when we think like that. This slide here presents the cover on a textbook at the graduate level in university on mineral nutrition of higher plants by Horst Marschner. And the cover shows us something that's very important to understand. We've got the idea in agriculture that we have to put nitrogen in the soil because in the atmosphere, even though nitrogen is 78% of the atmosphere, it acts as though it is an inert gas. Now, nitrogen actually is something that every plant must have for its DNA, for any of its protein chemistry. It must have nitrogen. And so for any kind of cell division or any of the protein operations that are going on, like chlorophyll in photosynthesis is a big nitrogen complex, and plants have to have the nitrogen. So where is it coming from? Well, we talk as though legumes fix nitrogen. Now that's loose talk, because what this picture shows is it shows a chickpea plant and a corn plant side by side with a pH indicator dye on a sheet that's in the soil up against the roots. And the pH indicator dye shows that even though the soil medium is a pH of 5, that the chickpea plant is 3.9 pH and the corn plant is 6.5. So what the chickpea is actually doing is it's giving off these organic acids into the soil around its roots that basically rely on oxygen for their acidity. So the chickpea plant, the legume, is drawing oxygen into the soil, and that's what releases calcium, magnesium, and other cations. So the lime complex, or the cations in the soil, are actually being released and woken up, you might say, by the legume. And they're quite important in, you might say, anchoring the nitrogen so that instead of being an inert gas, then it operates in the chemistry of the living organisms. And that requires calcium and other cations to fix the nitrogen. So what's actually happening is there are microorganisms that live in nodules on the roots of legume plants like chickpeas that do the nitrogen fixing, and the legume is actually bringing oxygen into the soil and unlocking the minerals that are necessary for the nitrogen fixers to do their job. And that actually shows us that legumes don't fix nitrogen, but they're great hosts for microbes that do. And so we shouldn't engage in that loose talk. We should pay attention to what it is that legumes are doing that is so important for nitrogen fixation. Because if we pay attention to that, then we will get the nitrogen fixing biology of the soil to work even without legumes. Now, the way that plants grow is they take up minerals, amino acids, and nutrients in general through the woody inner portion of the root called the xylem. This is fibrous, and it's like a highway or a passageway that all the nutrition is taken from the soil that goes up to the leaves and to the growing tips in plants. So that woody central portion, which is known as the xylem, is what the plant uses to take up its minerals and amino acids. This then feeds cell division, chlorophyll production, and the plant's photosynthetic chemistry that's going on in the leaves. And then when the sun goes down again and relaxes the tension in the plant, then in this layer just under the skin of the root, the plant is leaking its sap back into the soil. And that zone there where the sap comes down again in the plant is called the phloem. It's just under the bark or skin on the root. And that feeds the microorganisms in the soil that depend on the plant for their energy. So they'll fix nitrogen, solubilize phosphorus, release potassium, other minerals, and so that soil's microbial life is actually dependent on root exudation from the plant. If the plant has a good day of photosynthesis, then it lets down a lot of energy to the soil around its roots. And this is how the plants in the wild have evolved and grown for many millions of years. In this slide we see the actinomycetes on this ginger root. Now this ginger root sprouted in the cellar over the winter, and so you can actually see the fuzz that's growing out of the xylem of the root. It's growing out as a white fuzz into the soil. Look at how delicate this actinomycete activity is. If you can imagine a soil that was, say, fed a whack of chemical fertilizer, then those salts in the chemical fertilizer would be strong enough to singe this off. It would be like taking a blowtorch in a lady's hair salon. And so chemical fertilizers tend to inhibit the growth of these microbes. But these microbes actually, with this fine fuzz, go out into the soil and contact the surfaces of soil particles, and that's where they pick up their minerals. Now actinomycetes perform another function in the soil that I heard about first when I took soil microbiology in 1971. And we were told that if it wasn't for actinomycetes that sort of clean up things in the soil, they're the mopper-uppers, and they tie up loose nutrients in clay-humus complexes, and they also like hold the plants, the soil around, the soil adhesion around the plant's roots, and they're the source of most of the antibiotics used in medicine. So, and they're endophytes. They live within the plant's tissues, which is why they're growing out of this ginger root in the cellar, even though it's out of the ground. But these are soil microbes that actually enter into the plant's tissues and live in between the cells in the plant's tissues. So they're growing out of the plant and they're growing through the plant. So they're part of the plant's, what you might call the plant's immune system. So they have a great deal of importance in the life of plants, the way that plants work. Now there's also phosphorus solubilizers. Those actinomycetes actually help to solubilize phosphorus, but there's many other kinds of phosphorus solubilizing microbes. So in this picture here you see Rhizobacter, and it's a classic phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. Azotobacter, these are nitrogen fixing microbes that also solubilize phosphorus, and they do this because the nitrogen fixing activity takes 10 units of sugar to make one amino acid, so this microbe has to have the phosphorus as a means of utilizing the sugar and getting the energy out of the sugar, metabolizing the sugar. Now in this picture here, this is a lamb's quarter plant. It's called Fat Hen in Australia, and it was growing on a compost pile in a vineyard in Long Island, and it was finishing its seed production at 2 feet high, and I thought, wow, this is on a compost pile, so it should be able to get enough nitrogen to be 6 feet high, and it's finishing everything up at 2 feet high. So that's a characteristic that shows that it's getting an extraordinary amount of silicon. And where would it be getting the silicon? And so we dug it up and took a look at its roots, and its roots were strongly like living in symbiosis with these mycorrhizal fungi, vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizae. And you can see all of this whitish growth in the soil there. And the mycorrhizae are also scavenging the silicon and feeding the plant, so that's how it got so much silicon. Mycorrhizae tie up loose nutrients such as nitrates in clay-humus complexes, so they're actually converting nitrogen compounds in the soil into stable humic complexes. And there's certain plants that are very good phosphorus solubilizers, of which buckwheat and your valerians are very good phosphorus solubilizers. So this activity is something that certain microbes specialize in and certain plants specialize in. When it comes to nitrogen fixation, we're used to seeing, like you can see in the rhizobia here in the panel, that the nodules, these were nodules on a soybean's root, and it's very heavily nodulated, so that soybean is just going great guns with its nitrogen fixation. But there's other kinds of nitrogen fixers that don't live in nodules on legume roots. There's hundreds of different varieties and species of nitrogen fixers, and probably the most famous are your azotobacters. In the Nile Delta, over 800 species of azotobacters have been classified. In the Mississippi Delta, it's been more like 600 different species. There's certain plants that really favor nitrogen fixation, and nettle is one of these. Nettle is a plant that itself is about 35 or 36% protein, so it's very good at feeding or hosting nitrogen fixing microbes, despite the fact that it doesn't nodulate. You look over here at this picture, this is a grassroots, and the soil adhesion zone on the root builds up. So out in the root tips where it's just did last night's growing, then it's bare. But as the actinomycetes and the root exudates complex the soil in this soil adhesion zone, then that's where the nitrogen fixation would take place in the vicinity of the roots. So there's quite a lot of nitrogen fixation that is going on in plants without nodulation and without leguminous activity. Now silicon is one of its primary elements in the way that plants work, the way that plants grow. Silicon is working in the summertime, in the daytime, and it works on the vertical axis. Silicon is important for the efficiency of photosynthesis, and those atmospheric processes that are working with silicon are blossoming, fruiting, ripening, and of course photosynthesis itself. So those are atmospheric processes. So we look at silicon as working in the atmosphere. Now, silicon's found in the cell walls, connective tissues. It's what holds plants erect. So you see a corn plant, a barley plant, that these stand straight up. And this little skinny stem that you see on a barley that holds the grain of the head of grain up, it has to be quite strong. So silicon is structural. Silicon is strong. So you'll see also in the animal realm, like diatoms, and you see the way this diatom has got this silica behavior. Anytime you see thorns, you see needles, you see very straight, sharp structures, then you're seeing silica in plants, or in microbes, or in animals. Bees are very much involved in the silicon activity of our environment, and they make their beehives look like little silica crystals all packed together. So silicon has a lot to do with sugar, so bees are storing sugar in these silicon-shaped beehive honeycombs. So you can see some of the things going on there with silicon. On the opposite side of things, we see calcium. Calcium works particularly well in the winter. It works in the earth, it works in the soil, and it works by night. So we see calcium in digestion. It's the basis of balancing the amino acids, the acidity in amino acids. So it's important in nitrogen fixation. It's working on the horizontal axis to fill things out. So what we see in an egg, for instance, that egg shell is a fat, a round sort of a structure. And so calcium is generally found in the cell nucleus. It's found in the bones. It's found in the center of things. So in a cell, the silicon is found at the cell walls, but the calcium is found in the cell nucleus. You see a plant like a legume is very rich in calcium. A plant such as a grass is very rich in silicon. So these are you might say, the opposite polarities in the minerals that you find in plants. Then there's clay and there's humus in the soil. So to sort of review there, silicon, which is the basis of sand, is an important component of the soil, and lime or calcium and its related cations are the basis of the lime polarity or the calcium polarity in the soil, and those are the important cations. But there's also clay, which is aluminum silicate, and it holds on to the lime. So the lime sort of is held by the clay, but even better, it's held by the humus. Now the humus, which is what we think of as the soil's active organic matter, complexes, it like sticks to the clay. So it forms clay-humus complexes, and this is where the activity in the soil will be found, is in the clay and in the humus. So you'll see a lot of activity between the lime and the silica, because clay is basically very much a silica compound, an aluminum silicate, and then the humus is taking the carbon side of things, and it's making this sort of food storage. It's the real life, or you might say the carbon basis for life in the soil. So you see sand or silica, you see lime, and you see clay, and you see humus. And that's what's making up the soil that the plant's growing in. Of course, the atmosphere is where the plant gets its carbon, its nitrogen, its oxygen, hydrogen, and even its sulfur. Now, the biological diversity of things has a lot to do with how plants grow. So what you find is like the corn here in this picture needs to have the balance. It's a silica plant, needs to have the balance of the legume, the lime plant, growing around it. And so those plants are actually cooperating. There's a principle going on here in nature called synergy. And synergy is where two or more different kinds of plants growing together actually produce a greater joint sum than if their sums were added together separately. So if you grew a corn plant all by itself without the soybean, and you grew soybeans all by themselves without the corn, then you'd add the product of that cornfield and the product of that soybean field and divide the area into the production, and you'd find that you'd get more production when you grow them together than when you grow them separately. And this is where in nature 1 + 1 is equal to 3, or some greater amount than just 2. Now there's also in the soil, there's all these microbial types. So you've got bacteria, and you have archaea, and you have fungi, and you have algae, and you have protozoa, and you have all sorts of microbial life in the soil. You also have soil animal life. So you've got earthworms and ants, which are large enough to be very visible, but there's a lot of other things going on in the soil animal life that are much too fine for the naked eye to see. So you have nematodes that are eating various things. There's fungal nematodes and bacterial nematodes and predatory nematodes that eat other nematodes. And there's plant-feeding nematodes. And it's really only the plant-feeding nematodes that endanger our crops, because the other ones are actually feeding the crops. They eat something, digest it. Because they're eating it in the vicinity of the plant's roots, which is where the soil biology thrives, then they also excrete those freshly digested nutrients right there in the vicinity of the plant's roots, and that's what provides the digestion that feeds the plant. So the soil's animal life is really quite important in feeding plants. Plants don't have a digestive system, but the environment around them provides this. So the animal activity is actually living in symbiosis with the plant. When the plant has to live without that animal life, then it needs the assistance of chemical agriculture, and it never gets as good a result in that fashion. So we can't really artificially feed plants the way that the soil's animal life can feed them. In nature, plants each specialize in different activities. So you have, this was a young banana plant, and it was planted in amongst deep-rooted legume cover. Bamboo, for instance, is one of nature's most successful, fastest growing silica plants, whereas kudzu is one of the nature's best, fastest growing leguminous plants. So you see a silica plant like bamboo and a lime plant like kudzu. Bamboo stands up straight and strong, and kudzu wallows all over everything and ties it up and brings it down. So you have two different opposites in bamboo and kudzu. And I have a neighbor that has kudzu growing all over his bamboo. And the cows get in there, they eat the leaves off the bamboo, they eat the leaves off the kudzu. They would kill the kudzu if it wasn't protected by the bamboo. They can't get to the crowns of the kudzu that are up in the bamboo. So actually they can only eat the kudzu that comes down out of the bamboo and hangs over it. So actually, when they're in that bamboo and kudzu, they never look fatter or shinier. These are two of the most nutritious plants for cows to eat. A plant like white oak here that you see in the picture, it has got a characteristic that it releases calcium from the soil. It's opposite sort of a tree here, the Australian casuarina, or what's in this country in America is called an Australian pine. It's a major silica tree. So it releases silica in the environment. You see something like yarrow that has got a terrific sulfur gesture, and stinging nettle that is the highest protein of any plant. Dandelions that are one of the most beneficial plants for fruiting activity, and chamomile, which is one of the most beneficial plants for the soil animals' digestion. So each of these plants is doing a job, and when we use these plants in combination, then it gets all the jobs done, and then you have what's called an ecosystem that is thriving. This slide here tells us a little bit about some of the soil's microbial life, the soil food web, and some of the important players in there. You have your actinomycetes, azotobacters. These ectomycorrhiza are fungal organisms that live on the surface of plants' roots. But there's also endomycorrhiza that live within the plant's roots and spread out from there. Your vesicular arbuscular mycorrhiza, these soil fungi, these different kinds of mycorrhiza are the basic organisms of what we call the soil food web. And plants actually communicate with each other through this mycorrhizal network. So it's the basis, you might say, of the intelligence of the ecosystem. So it's really quite important that we foster and feed and favor this soil food web. Your soil's animal life, if you looked at this central part of this slide, then you could look at it really fine. You can magnify it, and you'll see that this soil is extremely porous. And the porosity is actually due to the soil's animal life, particularly things like your mites, your nematodes, little tiny animals that are burrowing through the soil, eating on the soil food web, and it's much finer than the eye can see. You can see in this soil many holes that probably were earthworms or grubs of some sort. It's a fairly good-sized animal, but you don't see the things that are much finer. But the soil's animal life, and for that matter, the animal life in the atmosphere, is extremely important to plants. Now, if there wasn't this animal digestion going on, then plant matter would build up on the earth and it would choke itself. So animals, like you see cows, and they graze the pasture off. Well, if there wasn't something that grazed the pasture off, it would grow up there and it would die and be standing in the way of future growth. And more growth coming up from the soil would have its sunlight cut off. So what cows actually do when they're properly managed is they'll eat off a pasture and move on to new pasture. And because we're keeping cows in fences, then we have to move them. But in nature, in the wild, cows move themselves, and they would come back to a place where they had eaten it off maybe a month earlier or even longer period of time and regraze that once it's ready to be grazed again. But it's very important that they get the old growth out of the way of the new growth. Otherwise, nature can't thrive. So without the animal life eating and digesting the plant life, then things would get stuck and the plants would grow up there and get in their own way. So this plant and animal dichotomy is actually a very important one in nature. We have to have those earthworms, those bees, those cows, as well as the plants that they feed off of. This is an even more porous soil picture, and it shows you how soil aggregation, which is a mechanical thing that's happening in the soil, but it's happening because of the activity of the soil food web. The different microbes in the soil are making sticky compounds, and some of these crumbs in the soil are held together by it. If they weren't held together, then all the little tiny passageways inside of those crumbs would collapse. And what we see when we cultivate a soil like with a rototiller in our garden is we actually grind up these soil crumbs and kill off the microbial life that's producing this aggregation of crumbs, and we actually collapse the passageways for air and water in the soil, and then the soil becomes compacted and hard and unproductive. So cultivation is a thing to be used sparingly because it has such an adverse effect on the soil's aggregation. So we want to be careful there and cultivate more or less a minimum in order to build good healthy soil. Now this is a ginger plant, and ginger is remarkable insofar as it's got three kinds of roots. You can see the storage root here. That is what we use as ginger. But the ginger plant also makes these little narrow roots that are its primary mineral uptake roots. So it's got those feeder roots that are branched out there, and they wiggle through the soil. They're very slender, highly branched roots. And it makes a third kind of root that just goes straight down, doesn't have any branches in it. It comes right out of the side of the storage root and goes down. The plant is actually sending down some of its photosynthetic product, and this fleshy big fat root is where the nitrogen fixation in digestion is taking place that feeds the cell division in the plant. So these are the nitrogen fixing roots of ginger, and it's where ginger hosts the nematodes and mites and other digestive organisms that eat the proteins of the nitrogen fixers and release the amino acids freshly digested. And ginger, once it gets on a roll, it can really grow. It's very efficient about photosynthesis because it developed as a rainforest understory plant. So it gets maybe about 2 feet tall maximum, and yet it's very efficient in its use of sunlight. So you might say that ginger is a ruminant. It's actually recycling some of its nutrition in these nitrogen fixing roots. This just shows you here with ginger what a rich symbiosis is going on between the plant and the animal life in the soil and the fungal and nitrogen fixing bacteria. And you can see here in a small area how much ginger is produced. Now in this slide, look what the soil looks like after the ginger is dug. There's all that crumb structure, all the, well, you see the earthworms in the picture. It went from being hard as a brick and very difficult to dig that bed, and now it's at the end of the ginger season. Then this was dug with a pitchfork, and it's shown so much improvement in the soil animal life. And this, if this understanding of how plants grow is used, then we don't need chemical agriculture, and we will get far better quality in the plants that we grow. One final slide in this series. This was on a school farm in Victoria, and I noticed that there were a lot of 4- and 5-leaf clovers, and this is a sign because the 4- or 5-leaf clovers occur because in the embryonic leaf development stage, then there's twinning. And where you see twinning, then the growth activity in the plant has to be very robust. And to see, this was a 4-leaf, this is a 5-leaf, and I guess this is another 5-leaf clover. For some reason we didn't see a 6-leaf. But this is just a sign of a farm that is really thriving. The soil biology and the plants that are growing there are growing great guns. This is a sign of good luck, according to our cultural ideas. And any farm that gets a lot of 4- and 5- and 6-leaf clovers is a farm that's thriving. So you could say that it's good luck. But it's not by chance that these things happen. It's by design. So the farmer that gets his soil food web thriving and robustly active will see a lot of 4- and 5- and 6-leaf clovers.